called Goodbye Anxiety, Depression, Addiction, and PTSD, the life-changing science of dual brain psychology. And it talks about 30 years of research that we've conducted at Harvard on this theory, and it's the first theory to come out of rigorous science and to be supported by rigorous science. And in the book, we present uh, uh, narrative fiction of therapy sessions with about five different patients of mine, and they're accurate representations, but it's fictional. It's sort of like when you see a television show of George Washington talking to Lafayette. It's uh, um, and so the what I want to talk about is what the book talks about, which is how traumas, which are usually unappreciated and covert, and that the patient may come in complaining of anxiety and or depression or addiction, um, and see that as coming from their genes or bad chemicals or something. And what I find is that all of these problems, all of them, come from bad experiences, and these bad experiences are traumas. And so I don't consider trauma just uh, sexual abuse or beatings. They certainly are, and they're severe traumas. Uh, um, uh, People in Gaza are certainly suffering severe trauma, and the Israelis certainly suffered severe trauma on October 7th last year. Um, uh, but most people suffer trauma that's more subtle and creates very significant problems for them. And so they might come to me saying that they're alcoholic, and I like to say that I don't have any alcoholics in my practice. I have trauma victims, and I help them understand um, where their trauma is located and how it has affected them and snowballed over the years and wound up uh, uh, with alcohol as a treatment for the trauma, and uh, and then uh, the alcohol becomes another trauma, a very severe trauma, and um, so that whether the person's suffering anxiety or depression or addiction, or all of these together, because most people with addiction also have anxiety and depression, uh, and all of it really is PTSD. So they're the title in the book. So it's all um, post-traumatic stress, but from stresses that are not usually recognized as traumas. And for example, it might be a parent who is neglectful or not very affectionate and maybe rejecting. And, uh, and children usually blame themselves for any uh, pain or problem that occurs. And so that they don't see that their parent could be troubled. And then they go to school and they're distracted because of the trauma at home. And so they don't do well at school. And then the teachers get angry with them and they have trouble getting into a peer group of successful students and it snowballs through life. Uh, and uh, and then in high school, they wind up getting involved with other traumatized individuals who were not doing well, and it solidifies their identification as someone who's deficient, and and then this is very painful and and that leads to substance abuse or just suffering anxiety. And the anxiety is usually about some kind of humiliation and some kind of feeling of inadequacy. And and anxiety, I think, is the feeling that we have when we anticipate danger. And when danger strikes, we get depressed, and and when we feel hopeless about the pain, that's part of the depression. And then if we try to solve the anxiety and the depression with exogenous substances like alcohol or heroin or now fentanyl. We're doing a study now on fentanyl addiction using one of the techniques that comes out of the theory. And the theory, actually, I should mention, is that each hemisphere of the brain is a separate brain and has a separate mind. So that ordinary people actually have two minds. So everyone, each of the minds has the same name and the same social security number, but there's a different experience. And so a person may wake up in the morning feeling very anxious and insecure, and then maybe at noon, they're feeling much better. And I think what they've done is they've switched hemispheres into a more positive mind. And the more negative mind is more of a child living in the trauma, living in the space where they're feeling inadequate and pained and the other side is feeling well. And so what we do in from my theory is we talk to the troubled side and we help it to understand that its feelings of inadequacy actually may not be based in reality.
So let
And
me ask you,
yeah.
Frederick, in regards to the anxiety and how it impacts us, you sometimes you'd hear people will subconsciously seek out those who are experiencing traumas that are similar to themselves, right? So you'll
Sure.
have someone that is experiencing anxiety, and then they'll end up in a relationship with someone that is experiencing anxiety as well. And then you have two people who are coming together, both traumatized in a very similar fashion, and they're surprised that they're unable to make that type of relationship work.
Mhm.
Now, based on what you shared with us today, what are some of the ways that we could, one, identify the type of trauma we have, and two, come up with a solution to either resolve it or at least minimize the impact that it has on us going into the future?
Very good questions. Um, the mind in the troubled hemisphere, in the troubled side of the brain, and it can be either the left brain or the right brain. I have to test the individual. Um, um, but that mind is a child's mind. And, you know, we talk about inner child. Well, the inner child actually lives in one of our brains, and sometimes it dominates, um, and, uh, and the child uh, uh, creates many solutions to deal with the trauma, and they're usually poor choices. And so it might be a poor choice of a peer group or of a partner. And so a lot of times the immature mind uh, uh, repeats the trauma and will pick a partner who is disrespectful and hurtful, like they experience in their trauma. And the child is thinking that, you know, I want another chance at it and I'll solve it next time. Sort of like a gambler who keeps losing and keeps betting and um, uh, so in order to uh, understand one's trauma, and everybody has some trauma, and um, uh, almost everybody, has some insecurities uh, and so the way to find it is to look for it. And today, in most psychotherapies, it's cognitive behavioral therapy. That's the most popular type of therapy today. And the purpose of that is to suppress your negative feelings. And if you have a negative thought, get rid of it. And I look at that as a a problem for most people if you just look the other way, you leave the insecurity sitting there. And so I want to go in and talk to the insecure little boy or little girl and help them uh, really understand how that happened and help them appreciate that they are valuable and lovable uh, and by doing that, it relieves the anxiety and the depression and then the substance abuse and
So, Frederick, since you mentioned that, because before you go on, I want to touch on that because I think that happens probably a lot more than people like to admit, that they start abusing things in their life. I spoke to someone who was traumatized, and what they did, they began to abuse their body in a sexual way,
Mhm.
right? And then you
Right,
mentioned earlier someone abuses their body in an alcoholic way. And then some
right,
people turn to drugs, some people may turn to finances. You gave the fantastic example of the
right.
gambling,
Mhm.
right? So, why do you think that one of the ways, at least early on, that we try to soothe ourselves from the trauma is to abuse ourselves or abuse ourselves in a way that is different than the trauma is currently impacting us?
Um, well, it actually is similar to the trauma, and again, the reason is that the person in the corner office, the chief executive, is 7 years old, and so children are very dogmatic, and they know that they have the right solution, and uh, and they don't their children, and so they don't have wise solutions, and so they try and repeat the trauma, or because it's all they know, and they want to keep fighting with it rather than understand it and grieve it and process it and heal from it. Um, I think the reason that so many people find bad solutions to a bad problem is that they have a 7-year-old person in them in one brain hemisphere, and and the solutions that that child chooses are uh, uh, usually destructive. Very rarely a child finds a library or some constructive solution.
Yeah, they're
And
not going out there to save the world because of their trauma, right?
Well, sometimes trauma can have positive effects if it doesn't destroy the person and dominate everything. Some trauma is, I think, helpful and it gives us some compassion and give us ambition. There can be good things that can come from trauma if we deal with it and if we have a healthy side that can help lead and um, uh, so I have some ways of stimulating one brain hemisphere or the other, and the person's personality changes within seconds, and so I can talk to each personality within a single person. and uh, it has to do with the way the eyes are connected to the brain. And if you look out of a lateral visual field, uh, uh, um, uh, you can actually stimulate the opposite hemisphere. And that the if I cover my eyes like this, so I'm looking out the right half of my right eye, and this would stimulate. And we actually see this in one of our studies was an imaging study of the brain while people looked out their right lateral visual field or their left lateral visual field while they're in the scanner. And what we found was that the brain hemisphere opposite to the visual field lit up like a Christmas tree. On the other side was dark, and it would flip when reversed the vision. So it actually has a physical effect on the brain just by looking out one half of one eye. Uh,
So if it comes down to that, Frederick, where it's more so like you mentioned, where there's a certain childlike personality
mhm.
within the person, right?
Yeah.
And then they have to somehow work to overcome that. What are some of the obstacles that are maybe preventing people from overcoming that
Yeah,
scenario?
it's a great question. One of um, one of the techniques that I have for stimulating the healthy mind is we have a special LED. It's called transcranial photobiomodulation, and we put it on the forehead, and the light actually goes through the skull into the brain and stimulates the healthy mind. And right now, we're treating fentanyl addiction with this, and we have an FDA breakthrough designation, which means the FDA was impressed with our uh, phase one study, and the National Institute for Drug Abuse gave us money to do a large study to get FDA approval. So and we have that study in process, and I'm blind to the results of the study, and that I don't know who's getting the active treatment or the sham treatment, but I can say that about half of the people are doing extremely well and about half aren't. And so I'm hoping that for the study's sake, that the people who are doing well are getting the active treatment. And they probably are because I don't think placebo treatment is going to treat fentanyl successfully. And uh, so if I put the light in, say, my private practice on a person's forehead and stimulate their healthy hemisphere, um, sometimes the little boy or little girl gets upset and says, "Oh, you're trying to get rid of me," and and even though the person might see that they would be better off using their healthy mind, the troubled mind is just like an individual doesn't want to give up their position and their power. Uh, so one of the difficulties in doing psychotherapy with a troubled mind is that the troubled mind is afraid that we're trying to get rid of it, and in a way we are trying to get the healthy side to take more of a leadership role, and the two sides can actually fight for dominance. It's very interesting, and um, so one of the main problems with a person's getting better is that the childlike mind doesn't want to relinquish the power and control that it's had all of these years, and yet, and I have to negotiate with it, and talk to it, and get it to see that we're not trying to destroy it. We're trying to help it, and that it's actually in a lot of pain. And we can, in other words, uh, have the healthy mind in the corner office, but give the troubled mind, marketing or shipping or in other words, be a part of a successful person, but not be the dominant player that it's been. And
So when you have those two areas working in a sense against each other,
mhm,
because you want the healthy mind or the healthy half or the healthy portion to
yeah,
be more dominant than the unhealthy, what are
yeah.
some of the dangers that arise during that situation where you have this kind of internal battle and you want to make sure that the healthy mind comes out on top and regains its dominance for a healthy future?
Um, Well, a patient of mine who was severely abused, but didn't recognize it as abuse. Just, saw, that he had inadequacies and came for severe depression and was suicidal. Um, when I would give him the light treatment, his depression would lift, and he was like profoundly depressed and would feel good, and uh, but he would downplay the experience, and he would say, "Oh, it's just like cocaine or something. It's not." Uh, it's not real, and and felt that it wasn't him, and he would become very hostile to me and be very critical that I'm not helping him and he would become like his abusive father and 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 I would point that out to him, that it sounds like you've become your father, and people do that, they identify with the abuser um, and I said that you're not only attacking me, but you also attack yourself, and that's your depression. And so it might be useful uh, to understand this better and not just beat me up and beat you up and somehow uh, um, I was persistent through his abuse, and I understood it, and wasn't personally offended or anything. After I'd say about 2 months, we had sort of a breakthrough, and he started crying, and he apologized for being abusive, and I pointed out that we really needed to help that little boy inside and so he's doing very well now. Uh, and,
I
and
actually, you reminded me of a friend that went through something similar where over time he became very aggressive
mhm,
physically, and in a lot of ways he started develop becoming verbally aggressive.
mhm,
And that reminds me of when we first met. Believe that that behavior was found in his household, but
mhm.
because we didn't connect it earlier on, we just kind of left it because he seemed pretty normal. He seemed pretty regular. Like, there's a lot of people who are walking around who are traumatized and they're everyday people. They
Right.
pay their taxes, they, shower twice a day, they do everything that, the common folk would do. But as he got older, we started to see the change, and then we saw the impact that it had on him. But most importantly, we saw how that impact was now impacting us. Because to your point, right, he was becoming like what he saw. And because he was becoming that way, maybe instead of dealing with it, he
Mhm,
started to project it onto others. And then that was how he was able to soothe himself by attacking a Fredric, attacking a terrain,
mhm.
attacking everyone, because you're letting it out, quote unquote, out of your system. You mentioned destructive behavior, and I see something like that being destructive.
Yes.
And we touched on some people are they abuse themselves. But do you
Yes.
see that side as well, where they go out and seek people to abuse in a
Yes.
way to overcome the trauma that they're feeling?
Yes. That happens often, and um, that people often repeat their traumas and go to great lengths to set it up. And they even can abuse a person so that they'll abuse them. And uh, uh, or they'll pick somebody who's abusive to begin with. But repeating the trauma is something that Sigmund Freud talked about, and he called it a repetition compulsion, a compulsion to repeat the trauma. And and uh, and I understand that now as a little boy inside, just not really knowing how to deal because he's just an immature mind, uh, and how to find a good solution. Because it's a serious problem that needs an intelligent solution, not a child solution. But the child solution is uh, uh, to uh, have another bout. Again, like the gambler, let me throw some more money in
One more hit. Just give me
one
one
more
more
hit.
hit.
Yeah, yeah.
So I have a question for you then, because we touched on those who are going through it, those who are traumatized.
Mhm.
What about the people who are being impacted by the outburst of those who are traumatized? How would they try to handle that type of situation, knowing that they don't necessarily have to be there, right? Let's say, for example, I'll give you an example. Let's say you have someone that was abused and they enter a marriage and now they become abusive of their partner, right?
Mhm.
How
Right.
would you counsel or guide, maybe, or what recommendations can you say for the person who's being impacted by the traumatized person and they want to figure out how to handle it and deal with it?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult um, question. And it's very hard, especially for a woman who has a physically abusive male who can be very nice for 6 days, and then the seventh day is drinking or just for whatever reason becomes physically abusive, or he might be miserable all the time. But it can create um, a horrible situation for the children, and a number of my patients were traumatized by being thrown down the stairs by their father when they tried to prevent father from beating up mother, and uh, and and again, these traumas weren't recognized when they came to see me. They came to see me because they were abusing drugs or suffering anxiety, um, uh, and and it's very helpful when they can make that connection to the trauma. Now that's a serious trauma. Now one patient of mine, uh, his uh, he was a black gentleman who lived in a project, and his father was very abusive to mother, and for a woman to leave an abusive man or to get a restraining order is very dangerous, and uh, and so. Um, it's very hard to advise a woman. That they need to have advice from someone who knows how to deal with violent people, and so I have to be very cautious if I'm advising someone in that situation. Uh, um, but what his mother did was she rented a truck and and drove her children, one of whom was my patient, to the Midwest, and got out of town, and and uh, uh, and got away from him. And then she went to college and got a social work degree, and she became a social worker and supported the family, and that was a good outcome. But she had to leave town. She had to get out of Dodge. Um, and um, most people can't do that, and it's a very difficult situation.
I agree. I dealt with someone, um, this was years ago. She was verbally abusive and verbally aggressive.
Mhm.
And because of my experiences and talking to people like you and working with all these different people, I suggested that she has to communicate some of these issues because it may be there may be underlying reasons why this is happening. There was some hesitation, and eventually the person did attempt to have a conversation about it, but it was haphazard, right? It was like, yeah, I'll kind of do it. It wasn't fully into it. And then there comes a point, at least in my experiences and the people I talk to, is that for your own peace of mind, you have to let that person deal with what they're dealing with, because not only is it impacting them, it's impacting you. And you've probably seen, right, where someone else's trauma ends up traumatizing someone else, and
Mhm.
then it traumatizes a third person. And now you have this group of people being traumatized because of one person. It could be very, very scary. And do you see that part of it where the trauma is not, because we talk about like generational trauma being passed down from
Right.
parents to
Mhm.
child, but do you see trauma being passed on from partner to partner, friend to friend, acquaintance to acquaintance?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Trauma is like a cancer. And uh, it actually, we talk about the fentanyl epidemic. Um, and before that, there was great distress in the medical field about oxycodone, and physicians got blamed for prescribing oxycodone. When at the time there was a feeling in medicine that we had to treat pain. People in pain needed to be treated. Today, people in pain can't get pain medicine, and so have to turn to fentanyl for pain. And it's kind of an unintended consequence of an effort to do good. It actually complicates things. And but the oxycodone epidemic and the fentanyl epidemic are are not due to cartels. And cartels are helping it. They're fueling it, but but they're really due to trauma, and that's not appreciated by the medical profession generally. When in this study that I'm running now, we have about 55 people enrolled in this study, and they all have severe trauma, or they come for treatment for fentanyl addiction, and I think that uh, if we uh, looked at the whole population of fentanyl uh, abusing people, we would find that 100% of them have significant